Before we begin, what time is it where you are? And where in the world are you listening from tonight? Let me know in the comments. I read every one. If you enjoy slow, sleepy journeys into the forgotten corners of history, tap subscribe. It helps more than you know. Now, settle in. Let's drift through the strange story of how virginity became currency in the ancient marriage market. Asterisk, they were born behind veils of linen and expectation. In classical Athens, to be born a girl was to be born into silence. Not only the cultural kind, where a daughter's thoughts were unwelcome at the symposiums of men, but a literal daily silence expected to be seen, prepared, and eventually priced. Virginity in this world was not just an ideal. It was a kind of stored value, protected by silence, wrapped in fabric, and traded at the moment when her body was no longer entirely hers. You begin in a small clay house in the Kerameikos district, where the hearth flickers gently and the smoke traces quiet stories into the rafters. A child is born, not to fanfare, but with a sort of resigned practicality. A daughter means negotiation. She is not given a name until the amphitromia, the ritual, several days after birth, where she is circled around the fire and formally accepted. Still, she is not registered like a boy, nor presented to the phratry, the all-important male kinship group. In law, she is invisible, not a citizen, not a voice, not a vote, but she is not worthless. Her worth is simply ... different. It is stored in her body, hidden beneath the folds of her peplus in the gaze of her father, who now begins the long work of preserving her value until it can be exchanged. From childhood, her voice is shaped to be small. Her footsteps are trained to be soft. She is taught to spindle, not to spear. Higher education is designed to preserve her virginity, to keep her away from anything that might tarnish it. The street, the symposium, the sight of foreign men. Athenian law was clear. A girl's virginity belonged to her father until he gave it to another man. And that man would want certainty. Certainty required silence. Certainty required witnesses. Certainty required control. The moment she reaches the age of marriage, usually around 14, a conversation begins. Not with her. She is not present. Her father meets with men in courtyards and under olive trees, discussing alliances. Sometimes they drink wine. Sometimes they argue over dowry values. But dowry, that heavy purse of silver, linen, household goods, is not a gift. Hey, it is a transaction. It reflects her value in the market of brides. But here's the subtle cruelty. The dowry was not for her. It was for him, the husband, the man taking custody of her untouched body. If she were a widow, the dowry would help secure a second marriage. If divorced, it would be returned. It floated between men, like a receipt, like a contract for a thing, both precious and perishable. And how did one ensure that precious thing, her virginity, was still intact at the time of exchange? In Athens, there was no physical test at the wedding. No stained cloth required, as in later cultures, but there were whispers, reputations, observations of her behavior. Had she been kept from the streets? Was she seen talking to slaves? Did she laugh too easily? Did her dress hang too loosely? These were not moral questions. They were financial ones. A girl's virtue was her father's credit score. One slip, one rumor, and her market value could plummet. She could go from a 30 mina dowry to a charity marriage, from a merchant's wife to a servant's. The wedding itself was a ritual of transfer, not celebration. The bride was veiled, draped in saffron, walked by torchlight from her father's house to her husband's. She was accompanied by friends, singing hymns that spoke not of love, but of boundaries. Gates crossed, doors closed, walls climbed. The moment she entered the oikos of her husband, she ceased to be part of her own home. The next morning, neighbors would listen, not for joy, for evidence. If a man returned his bride within a day, claiming she had not been as promised, it would be her father's shame. If her virtue had been sold falsely, the dowry might be returned, but the stain, literal or figurative, could not be scrubbed. Girls had few choices. There was no school for them, as there was for boys. They learned domestic arts. They learned obedience. They learned how to prepare the bridal bath, how to stand still while being examined by aunties and neighbors, how to carry themselves as currency. Some rebelled quietly. We hear whispers in texts. A girl who ran away, a woman who refused marriage, a hetera who read poetry instead. But these were exceptions, and they paid the price. In most households, virginity was not a trait. It was a product. And the silence of girls was not merely tradition, it was marketing. But what happens when that system meets failure? What if a girl loses her virginity, not through rebellion, but through violence? What recourse does she have in a society where her purity is her only proof of value? That question, painful, persistent, leads us into the quiet corridors of Athenian law, into the story of a girl named Timandra, whose worth was measured in silence. Until silence was no longer possible. The court records of ancient Athens don't often tell the stories of women, but sometimes, between the pages of speeches written for male litigants, voices raised in defense of property, contracts, and status, a woman's life leaks through. A name appears. Deed is mentioned. A misfortune is described. Always secondhand, always refracted through male concern. And from these glimpses, we begin to see something of the lives that were hidden behind the courtyard walls. Timandra is one such name. Her story comes to us not from a poem or a myth, but from a legal speech, a court defense written by the orator Lysias, known for his sharp words and tidy logic. The case itself is typical, a man suing another over a domestic dispute, but within the folds of the argument, we find a sentence that quietly opens a door. ... For he dared to violate Timandra, my daughter, who was not yet betrothed, thereby reducing her worth and bringing shame to our household. There is no elaborate lamentation, no appeal to the gods, just a statement of value lost. And yet, in that brief mention, an entire world unfolds to understand Timandra's fate. You must first understand what virginity meant in the context of Athenian law. A girl was under the legal guardianship of her kyrios, typically her father, who held responsibility for all decisions concerning her person and her property. Her virginity, while not legally defined as a tangible asset, functioned as a form of protected capital. An unmarried girl who had been raped was not seen as a victim in the way we might understand the term today. Rather, she was damaged goods. The crime was against the kyrios, the father, whose ability to marry her off with a full dowry and a good match had now been compromised. The law did not seek to comfort her. It sought to redress the loss of transactional value. This meant that if the man who raped her could be identified, he might be fined, not for violating her dignity or safety, but for interfering with a future marriage contract. Alternatively, he might be required to marry her himself with no dowry, taking responsibility for what he had devalued. Such was the framework into which Timandra fell. We know little of her age, only that she was not yet betrothed, which likely places her around 13 or 14, still a child by modern standards, but very much on the edge of the marital transaction in her time. Her father's use of the phrase "not yet betrothed" is telling. It reveals intent. His plans were likely in motion. Conversations had begun. Dowry sums had been floated, expectations drawn, and then something happened. The details are not recorded. Was it an act of calculated dominance by a man within the household, a slave, a tutor, a guest, or a moment of vulnerability while fetching water, walking to the agora, stepping too far from the protection of the home? We do not know. All we have is the consequence. She was no longer untouched, and so negotiations stalled. the bridal market turned its face away. The father brought his case not to defend his daughter's trauma, but to argue the measurable impact on his house. He cited the shame. He noted the loss of a high-ranking match. He made clear the price difference. He wanted reparations, not for his daughter's future, but for his own. What happened to Timandra after the case? We do not know. She may have been quietly married off to someone of lower standing, her dowry reduced. She may have been sent to serve in a religious cult, where women could disappear from the market and exist in a different kind of silence. Or she may have remained unmarried, a financial liability in her father's house, a figure of sympathy and suspicion. And yet, even in her silence, her story reveals something quietly powerful. Because in Athens, the system was fragile. It relied on perception, on collective belief in purity, on networks of reputation and rumor. When that belief was interrupted, when a girl's value was called into question, not by her actions, but by another's violence, the entire mechanism faltered. Timandra's case shows the cold logic of the system, but it also exposes its weakness, its dependence on external control, on the monitoring of women's bodies, and on the dangerous notion that virginity could be treated as a quantifiable object, something you either had or didn't, like loaf of bread or a coin. But what if a girl said no? What if she refused to participate? What if she walked away from the marriage market entirely? It rarely happened, but it did. Sometimes, resistance in history does not come with swords or speeches. Sometimes, it arrives quietly with the simple act of doing nothing, of not showing up, of not accepting the terms of a transaction that was never yours to agree to. Story survives not in courts or scrolls, but in the recollections of a later philosopher who wrote of a girl in Athens who refused to dioikos, brought shame upon her house by declining every match, every dowry, and every perfectly calculated marital proposal. She is mentioned briefly in the writings of a Stoic lecturer, not by name at first, but as the maiden of bronze will. When her name appears later, it is given with reluctance. It's as if writing it down would immortalize something inappropriate. Pharynx. Refusal was not loud, but it echoed. She came from a family of modest status, not aristocrats, but well-placed traders in the port of Piraeus. Her father had ambitions. He sought a match with a family whose olive groves stretched along the outer limits of Attica, land-rich, but in need of liquidity. A dowry of 10 minas was prepared, a significant sum, requiring loans and pledges. Nike, about 13 at the time, was instructed in her duties. Her wedding clothes were commissioned. Linen was stitched and folded. Tania walks were shortened, gossip was suppressed. Everything was moving according to plan. But one morning, when asked to come meet the matchmaker, she did not leave her chamber. That evening, she refused again, and again the next week. She did not argue. She did not cry. She simply would not comply. This placed her father in a difficult position. Her daughter, refusing marriage, risked not only shame, but legal uncertainty. Curious, he had the right to arrange her marriage, but the law did not clearly compel physical enforcement. He could punish her, withdraw food, isolate her, and many fathers did. Some were said to have locked daughters in interior rooms until they relented. But Veronique held her silence. She spun wool. She tended the hearth. She did everything else, just not the one thing expected of her. Soon, her story began to circulate, first among neighboring women, then among merchants at the port. Some whispered that she was mad. Others suggested she had taken secret vows, though no temple claimed her. One version claimed she had spoken of a dream, a vision in which the goddess Hestia forbade her to marry. Another said she simply saw the transactional nature of the system too clearly, found no interest in being traded. But whatever her reason, she did not marry, and this created problems. Her father, seeking to reclaim control, petitioned the local dean council to permit her entry into a temple cult, perhaps of Artemis or Athena, where unmarried women could serve out their lives in ritual silence, removed from civic life. But she refused that too. She did not want the roles prepared for women, not as wife, not as votary, not as prostitute, not as servant. She wanted only her own room, her own weaving, in her own time. This, of course, could not last forever. Eventually, her father withdrew her dowry and disinherited her. But by then, she had made arrangements of her own. A childless aunt, widowed and left in control of a small sum of land, took her in quietly. No legal adoption, no announcement, just a new place to live. And there, in the dry hills beyond Athens, Virginity lived out her days, weaving cloaks for sailors and tending a small garden. She was not famous. She left no writings. But her name became a murmur among midwives and mothers, a symbol of quiet refusal. The irony is not lost on historians in a society obsessed with guarding female virginity. The woman who protected hers most fiercely, not from men, but from them, was seen as unnatural. Her virginity was no longer a commodity because she would not allow it to be traded. In rejecting the system, she exposed its absurdity, the economy of silence, where a girl's purity could be measured and exchanged, could only function if all the pieces consented, or at least obeyed. Virginity chose not to obey, and the system had no tools for that by the time she died. No record tells us when her story had faded from official memory. But her small act of resistance left an imprint not in statues or texts, but in the cautious curiosity of other girls. A reminder that even in the most controlled environments, there are always cracks, small ruptures, quiet corners where refusal can grow. And so, in Athens, the economy of virginity continued, dressed in veils, kiza, passed through contracts, hidden in the folds of woolen cloaks. But it was never again unshakable, because somewhere in the back of the mind, behind every whispered negotiation and calculated dowry, there was the ghost of a girl who simply stayed in her room. What would the market do, if the product refused to be sold? Asterisk, you stand in the dusty center of Babylon, near the banks of the Euphrates, where the morning air is still thick with incense and sun-warmed grain. Here, behind the temple precinct, and not far from the ziggurat of Etemenanke, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, people are gathering, not for worship, not for judgment, but for an auction, not of land, nor cattle, but of women, not enslaved women. Though the practice of slavery is alive and cruelly well in the kingdom of Hammurabi, but free-born daughters of Babylonian families, brought here by their fathers, not to be sold, but to be selected. These are the bride markets, Herodotus would later call them when he visited Babylon centuries later and documented the practice with a kind of horrified curiosity. But what he saw, or thought he saw, was only one version of a tradition with far deeper roots in ancient Mesopotamia, especially during the height of Babylonian prosperity. The marriage market functioned less as a place of exploitation and more as a structured public ritual, a cultural mechanism meant to reinforce order, preserve community ties, and distribute beauty, virtue, and opportunity in an oddly egalitarian way. Or at least, that was the official line. The truth, as always, rested in the details, once a year, at the edge of town or within an enclosure near the main temples. Families gathered to present their eligible daughters, girls typically between the ages of 12 and 16, their heads covered in colored veils, their bodies modestly wrapped, their eyes often downcast. Each girl's name, lineage, and sometimes even measurements were recorded beforehand by scribes. They were not being sold. Not technically. No coin changed hands to acquire a bride. Rather, the highest bidder offered a marriage price, a kind of dowry in reverse, that would be given to the family of a less desirable girl in the same market, ensuring that no daughter, regardless of appearance, was left unmarried. Herodotus, wrote that the most beautiful girls were auctioned first, and their marriage payments were pooled to provide for the less attractive ones, an early form of redistribution. It's framed in moral terms. In theory, it was an act of balance. In practice, it was a spectacle. The auctioneer, often a priest or temple official, stood on a raised platform and called for attention. One by one, girls were brought forward. They were praised not only for beauty, but for modesty, silence, obedience, sometimes for their weaving skill or their ability to manage a household. Their value was not just in the shape of their face or the color of their eyes, but in their reputation, carefully managed by the mother and father, carefully watched by neighbors. Virginity here was assumed. To suggest otherwise was to invite shame and ruin. No tests were given. No questions were asked, but silence, once again, acted as proof. And for the most beautiful girls, bids could be generous. Large sums were offered, not just in silver, but in livestock, wine, and land deeds. These marriage payments, called terhatum, were understood as proof of seriousness, not purchase. And yet, the effect was the same. Young women were distributed according to desirability, determined largely by men who had never spoken a word to them. But the real heart of the ritual, the thing that made it more than just a transaction, was what came after. Once the top-tier girls were married off and their marriage payments collected, the funds were gathered and redistributed to families with daughters who had received no offers. For them, the ritual was not about gain, but dignity. No girl was to be left unmarriageable. The least desirable were matched with men who received compensation, essentially being paid to marry them, so that no daughter would remain in her father's house, unmarried, ashamed, a burden. It was a form of economic matchmaking disguised as justice. But justice for whom? For the girls who ranked high on the auction stage, the process could feel like elevation. They were whisked into households of wealth, married to men of influence. For others, it was humiliation, their names called again and again, only to be met with silence. Some were whispered about for a limp, a disfigured hand, a sharp tongue caught once at the well. And yet, in the end, all were married. The market allowed no exceptions. At least, that was the intention. But what of the girls themselves? They did not choose. Their futures were selected for them, filtered through their beauty, their obedience, their father's aspirations. They stood, veiled beneath the sun, waiting to hear their price spoken aloud. Fates decided by strangers with money in their hands and opinions in their mouths. One such girl, hinted at in a fragmentary tablet, now housed in the Louvre, was named AAA-ZI-KUNU, or the Mother Who Knows. Her story survives only in pieces, a legal complaint filed years after her marriage, claiming mistreatment by her husband, and arguing that the marriage, having begun under false promises, should be annulled. What those promises were, we do not know, but the fact that she lodged a protest and that it was recorded at all suggests something remarkable, that even in a market where girls were auctioned like livestock, some still dared to raise their voices. And Amazi's case brings us to the heart of the matter. What happened after the auction? What did it mean to be chosen, taken, married into a household you'd never seen? What did life look like for these brides once the veils were removed and the rituals ended? Did the market provide dignity or merely disguise its absence? We now follow Amazi Kanu into her marriage and into the quiet struggle that followed, a story not of auctions, but of locked doors and whispered prayers. Asterisk, the auction ended at dusk. The dust that had stirred beneath the auctioneer's platform settled in the air like a fine film, almost ceremonial in the way it coated every veil, every foot, every whisper. Girls were taken down one by one. Some cried. Some stared ahead, silent and still as statues. Some dared to glance sideways at the man they had just been given to. Mose did not speak. AMA-ZA-KUNU was among the last to be chosen. She was not unappealing, not poor, not ill-formed. But she was quiet, and not in the demure, obedient way the market rewarded. She had a reputation, not for sin, but for questions. She had once asked a temple scribe how the gods decided the future of the moon. She had been caught reading a broken tablet meant for her brother. These things were remembered. Her father, anxious to preserve the family's dignity, accepted a modest bid. And so, at the age of 15, Amazikanu was led by torchlight to the home of her new husband, a man nearly 3 times her age named Baal-Shunu, a merchant of bricks and bitumen. He had no wife, no children, and little patience. His house was not grand, a 3-room structure near the city's edge, shaded by drying reeds and walled in ochre clay. The inner chamber, where she was led, was small and warm and smelled faintly of oil and old wool. Her veil was lifted by a servant, not by Baal-Shunu, who had gone to account for the dowry and settle debts. That first night was no ceremony, no greeting, only silence. And so it began. Life inside a Babylonian household was shaped by routine and hierarchy. A wife, particularly one acquired through the market, was expected to maintain the home, manage provisions, prepare offerings, and, above all, produce children. Mazi understood these duties. Her mother had drilled them into her with quiet precision, but Baal-Shunu was not interested in companionship. He spoke only of work. He spent his days near the canals, overseeing shipments, measuring bricks, and arguing with junior scribes. At home, he demanded stillness. When meals were late or fabric was not mended to his liking, he spoke sharply. When the winds rose at night and the roof creaked, he accused her of bringing unrest to the household. But what disturbed him most was her silence, not the obedient kind he expected, but a silence that felt watchful, unyielding, as if she were listening to something deeper than his voice. After 6 months, no child had come. This was not unusual, but in Babylon, childlessness was never seen as mutual failure. It was the wife's body that bore the blame. Baal-Shunu began to mutter about defective goods, and he referenced the auction with bitterness, as though he'd been tricked. He questioned the priests. He asked if perhaps she had not been a virgin. Asked about curses. Amazikunu said nothing. She tended the fires. She recorded the household oil on tablets when no one watched. She repaired the linen, and she waited. Then came the incident. One afternoon, a dispute arose between Baal-Shunu and a canal worker, a matter of price and quality. The argument turned public. Shouting spilled into the street. Amazikunu, from within the shadows of the house, watched silently. When Baal-Shunu returned, still seething, he accused her of being a bad omen. A key struck her. Once, on the side of the face, she bled, and for the first time, she spoke. Not to him, but to the local shrine priestess, to whom she presented a modest offering and a request for intervention. It was an unusual move. Wives did not typically bring complaints against husbands, but Amazikunu was learned, and more importantly, she was precise. She brought a clay tablet with a list of market witnesses from her auction day, names etched in script, confirming the promises made at the time of her marriage. Among them was a clause, rare but binding, that if the husband mistreated her without fault, she could appeal to the temple for arbitration. This clause saved her. The temple called Baal-Shunu to account. He denied the beating, claimed her barrenness had brought shame, but the market record was clear. No children after 6 months did not constitute abandonment, and the priestess moved either by justice or by the unusual clarity of Amazikanu's request. Ordered restitution. Amazikanu was permitted to return to her father's house, her dowry unreturned. She had the eyes of the market. fulfilled her end of the contract. She had been chosen. She had obeyed. She had endured. But she had also known her rights. What followed was unexpected. Her father, instead of seeking a second match, enrolled her in service at the temple of Ishtar, not as a votary in the holy hierarchy, but as a steward of household records. She helped manage marriage contracts, calculate bride prices, record dowries for other girls like her. She became a scribe, and over time, her story began to circulate, first in whispers, then in footnotes. The girl who came from the auction block and left a marriage intact, untouched, not through rebellion, but through the quiet execution of law. Ziakuno's story doesn't end in victory. She was still a woman in a patriarchal world. She never remarried. She never bore children. She died young, of illness, according to a burial record. But her name and the record of her marriage clause appear in multiple surviving tablets. Referenced as precedent, she had taken part in the system, yes, but she had also learned to read its rules and use them, and that raises a question, not easily answered. Were the bride markets truly about fairness, about ensuring every woman was married? Or were they simply rituals to mask the lack of choice with the illusion of dignity? In the final section, we'll explore how the bride markets were eventually replaced, what pressures led to their quiet decline, and what remained of their promises. Long after the veils had been lifted, the Babylonian bride markets did not vanish with war or revolution. They faded, not with fire, but with time. With the rise and fall of temples, the shifting of trade routes, the creeping standardization of law, in their place came new rituals, quieter negotiations, private contracts, still unequal, still transactional, but less theatrical. The auction block gave way to the writing table. Public spectacle dissolved into private arrangement. But for centuries, these markets had stood as one of the most visible intersections between gender, economy, and ritual, and their disappearance is no less telling than their existence. By the 6th century BCE, Babylon had begun to change. The city was no longer merely a sacred center, it was a global capital. Under kings like Nebuchadnezzar II, who ruled during the city's golden age, Babylon swelled with architecture, bureaucracy, and a more rigid stratification of class. The temples, once central to daily civic life, were now increasingly ceremonial and political. Marriage became a more privatized affair. Instead of public auctions, elite families began to form unions through written contracts, sealed by witnesses and clay tablets, often negotiated far in advance of the girl's coming of age. The market, once framed as a social equalizer, was now viewed by the powerful as vulgar, a practice better suited to villages and outer provinces, not the royal heart. And so, like many institutions, it was not outlawed, only outgrown. But the logic remained. We see this in the contracts. Dozens of Babylonian marriage documents from the 5th and 4th centuries BCE survive today, unearthed in the ruins of private homes and temple storehouses. Many include detailed clauses, conditions for divorce, lists of property, stipulations regarding fidelity, and nearly all of them begin the same way. Bride's name, daughter of father's name, a virgin. It is a declaration, a formal guarantee. But more than that, it is a holdover from the market, a shadow of the time when virginity was not just assumed, but priced, where the bride's value began not with her land or her smile, but with the unbroken seal of her imagined purity. The auctions were gone. The veil remained. For women in later Babylonian society, life had improved in some ways. With the market fading, they had more opportunities to marry within their own social circles. They could become business partners, temple stewards, even lenders. Records show women owning property, initiating contracts, even suing in court. But marriage remained a transaction. Virginity remained a currency. in the pressure to be silent, modest, untouched, remained as strong as ever. Even without the public stage, some scholars argue that the decline of the bride markets was in part a response to discomfort, both moral and political. The spectacle of ranking girls by beauty and marrying them off under public gaze may have felt too raw. It's openly commercial. It's for an empire that prided itself on divine justice and cosmic order. Others suggest that temple reforms, driven by shifting priestly power, discouraged such rituals to preserve sacred space for religious ceremony. Okay, not social matchmaking, but the reason hardly matters. What matters is the echo. Asterisk. Even centuries later, the memory of the markets lived on in texts, in stories, in the quiet shame of girls who feared they might not be chosen. In Herodotus's writing, the event is framed with a mixture of fascination and judgment, as though he could not decide whether it was noble or grotesque. Later historians debated whether the story was real at all, but the tablets remain, and so do the names Ama-Zi-Kunu, Belshunu, dozens of others, each etched into clay, each preserving a moment when a girl's future was spoken aloud by a man who had never heard her speak. The slow disappearance of the bride market is a reminder that not all change in history comes from rebellion. Some systems simply drift into irrelevance, but even as they vanish, their logic can remain hidden in rituals, in language, in expectations that outlive the buildings where they were once made visible. And so we leave Babylon, its walls still high, its rituals still echoing, and turn to another place, another culture where virginity was not just private value, but public proof. In ancient Rome, the bridal chamber itself became a courtroom. The blood on the linen was not just expected, it was required. Why did Roman husbands demand evidence of purity the morning after their weddings? And what happened when the proof didn't appear? We turn next to the strange and legalistic obsession with Virgo intacta, in a world where a single stain could define a family's honor. Asterisk. In ancient Rome, marriage was never simply a private affair. It was ceremony, contract, courtroom, all wrapped in laurel leaves and set beneath the watchful eyes of gods, ancestors, and property law. For elite Roman families, every union was a negotiation of honor, status, and legacy. And at the center of it all, hidden behind veils and ritual and myth, was a single expectation: proof, not proof of love. Not even proof of consent, but physical, bodily proof that the bride was a Virgo intacta, untouched, sealed, unspoiled. And on the wedding night, that proof was not metaphorical. It was material, literal, often linen. You were seated, perhaps reclining on a carved wooden couch, in a wealthy Roman domus, candles flickering low against the marble walls. A feast has just ended. The bride, draped in the orange-red flammeum, her hair parted with a spear, her belt knotted tightly around her waist, has been walked from her father's home to her husband's threshold. She has been carried over the doorway, not for romance, but to prevent ill omens from clinging to her feet. She is called upon the gods: Juno Pronuba, goddess of marriage; Venus, goddess of beauty; Diana, guardian of chastity. She has laid her hands on the household Lares, the ancestral spirits of the home, and now she waits. The bed is not entirely private, it is sacred. The lectus geniales, the marital bed, was a symbol of the union and the future of the household. In elite families, the consummation of marriage was not left solely to the couple's discretion. It was observed, not visually, but socially. Maids and midwives lingered nearby. Servants prepared the linens. The family waited for news. And in some cases, the next morning, a bloodied sheet would be quietly displayed, not to shame, kata, to prove that the bride had filled her role, to prove that the father had not lied, to prove that the transaction, the das, or dowry, had been properly exchanged for something genuine, because in Roman law, if a man claimed he had received a wife who was not a virgin, he could, in some circumstances, demand restitution. This was not just cultural. It was legal marriage in Rome, particularly among the patrician and senatorial classes, was a contract, a formal agreement between two families, often sealed by a sponsalia betrothal and supported by a written record. A dowry transferred from the bride's father to the groom, sometimes in coin, more often in land or goods. It was meant to help support the new household, but also served as collateral, a kind of surety, one that might be returned if the marriage ended under specific terms. But there were risks. If a bride was discovered not to be a virgin, and this fact had been concealed at the time of marriage, the husband could claim fraud. He might pursue legal remedies, and though the punishment was not always enforced, especially in the later Republic and early Empire, the stain on the woman's name could be enough to exile her from polite society. Her dowry might be forfeited. Her family's honor would suffer. Her future would collapse. And so, the wedding night was transformed into a kind of soft tribunal. The bride's body was both witness and evidence. If blood was found on the linen, the so-called testimonium virginitatis, the household breathed easier. The father's reputation remained intact. The mother's supervision was vindicated. The marriage could proceed if no blood appeared. There were explanations, of course. Physicians, many of them Greek, knew that not all women bled on their first intercourse. Hymenoanatomy, though not fully understood, was known to vary. But in matters of honor, biology was a weak defense. Rumors could spread. Questions would be asked, and in some cases, the bride herself might be blamed for being too active, too curious for horseback riding or dancing, or even walking improperly. She might be accused of impurity, not because of anything she had done, but because of something her body had failed to do in the right moment. The stories are not plentiful. Roman authors, overwhelmingly male and aristocratic, rarely dwelled on the perspectives of women. But now and then, in letters and legal commentary, traces emerge. Pliny the Younger, for instance, mentions a friend whose new wife was accused by the household of deception because no blood had appeared. Pliny, typically thoughtful, suggests that it may have been the result of fear or inexperience, but even he does not deny that suspicion was reasonable. In another case, jurist Ulpian discusses the possibility of a dowry being returned under accusations of fraudulent chastity. The term itself, fraus virginitatis, implies deception so fundamental it could nullify the contract. For some families, this meant taking extra precautions. Some fathers included virginity guarantees in their betrothal documents, pledging the honor of the bride and, by implication, agreeing to financial penalties if she were found used. Some employed midwives to examine the girl before marriage. Some simply hoped that the blood would come, whether by nature or by other means. There were, of course, consequences for false accusations. A man who slandered his wife without cause could face fines, particularly if his accusations disrupted the alliance or caused political scandal. But such punishments were rare, especially in cases where no physical harm was done, and the burden of proof always lay with the wife. She had to defend her purity, even if there was nothing to defend. And yet, despite all this, some women found ways to resist. Some refused the rituals. Some fled arranged marriages before this wedding night. Some took their cases to sympathetic magistrates, citing coercion or deceit. A few even became legal precedents, their names recorded not as wives or daughters, but as litigants. Their victories were rare, but they existed. And so we return to the bed, to the sheet, to the body of a girl, raised to believe that her first night was not a threshold into adulthood, but a test, a weighing, a gamble that she might not even know she was taking. What does it mean to live in a world where your worth must be demonstrated in blood, where your value is tied to an accident of anatomy, a single moment, a visible stain? And what happens when that stain never appears? In the next section, we follow one such Roman bride, Aelia Severa. Whose wedding to an emperor's son would erupt into scandal over this very question. Was she a virgin? And who, in the end, had the right to decide? Asterisk. She was not a peasant girl or the daughter of a merchant. Aelia Severa was the child of Roman nobility, born into a family woven tightly into the imperial fabric of the early 3rd century CE. Her lineage was impeccable, her education careful, her movements watched, her steps measured, her voice trained in the soft, restrained tones of elite Roman womanhood. She was raised not to inherit land, but to inherit silence and to carry it with her into marriage. What made Aelia different was not her birth, even her betrothal, but the man who chose her. His name was Elagabalus, and his reign was not like the others. Elagabalus, born Varius Avitus Bassianus, came to power in 218 CE, an emperor at just 14 years old, propelled to the throne through military maneuvering and the ambitions of his grandmother, Julia Misa. He was a high priest of a Syrian sun god, Elagabal, and attempted to integrate his native cult into the Roman pantheon with scandalous results. He shocked Rome with his behavior, public cross-dressing, lavish rituals, exotic deities, and what contemporary writers called effeminate tastes. But perhaps nothing ignited more gossip than his marriages, and among them, the one to Aelia Severa. The match was puzzling. Aelia was a Vestal virgin, one of the sacred 6 women sworn to remain, chaste for 30 years in service of Vesta, goddess of the hearth. Their purity symbolized the health of Rome itself. To violate that vow through choice or force was considered a crime against the state. Vestals found guilty of breaking their vow were buried alive. So, when Elagabalus married Aelia Severa, he didn't just break a taboo, he cracked the foundation of Roman religion. Asterisk. He claimed the union was symbolic, a fusion of divine forces, uniting his sun god with the hearth goddess. He was not merely marrying a woman, he was staging a theological merger. He dismissed traditional Roman deities and placed his god, Elagabal, above Jupiter. To him, Aelia was not a bride, but a vessel, a ritual, a statement. But to Rome, well, she was still a Vestal, and Vestals did not marry. The outrage was immediate. Senators were aghast. Priests murmured. The people, who rarely cared for theological nuance, saw the marriage as a direct threat to the god's favor, a potential reason for famine, plague, or political instability. But the true scandal came the morning after. Rumors swirled that Elagabalus had expected signs of virginity, and when none appeared, he grew enraged, that he paraded the sheets through the temple, demanding they be recognized as sacred proof. That Aelia, humiliated and confused, returned to the Vestal house in tears. None of these accounts are confirmed, but they appear fragmented in sources like Cassius, Dio, and the Historia Augusta, interspersed with sneering, commentary, and sneer, mockery of Elagabalus's gender and behavior. Whether Aelia bled or not on that wedding night became, somehow, a political matter, a sign of decadence, a symbol of decline. The bridal blood tax had risen to the level of empire. What we do know is this: within months, Elagabalus divorced Aelia, claiming spiritual reasons. Then, in an erratic turn, he married her again, and then divorced her again. Some saw it as madness. Others saw it as an attempt to provoke, to unsettle the conservative pillars of Roman power. Aelia Severa's fate afterward is unclear. She disappears from the records. No public punishment, no burial alive. Likely protected by her family's status. She may have lived out her life in quiet disgrace. Neither Vestal nor wife, suspended between roles, like so many women whose bodies were used as symbols. And still, the question lingered. Was she a virgin? And did it matter? To the Romans, it mattered immensely, not for reasons of intimacy or trust, but because her body was a vessel for meaning. Chastity was Rome's health. Her purity was the empire's assurance. A stain on the linen was reassurance. A missing stain was suspicion, accusation, even threat. In this context, the obsession with bridal proof becomes more than PRUD. It becomes a form of state control. Women like Alia Severa were not judged as individuals. They were frameworks, ritual roles. Their virtue was not theirs. It was the possession of the city, of the gods, of tradition. And when those roles blurred, when vestals married, when sheets came back unstained, Rome itself shivered with anxiety. What was at stake was not a marriage, but order. And yet, in the final years of the empire, the obsession began to fade. As Christianity rose and Roman customs splintered, new definitions of purity emerged. Spiritual, not physical. Virginity became metaphor. Proof was no longer a cloth, but a vow. The sheets were replaced by doctrine, but the idea that a woman's worth could be measured by her body's first wound lingered long after. Even now, in texts and tales, the myth of the wedding night, the silent test, the need to prove something that should never have required proof, remains in our final section. We follow how this legacy was absorbed and transformed in Christian Rome, where virginity took on divine dimensions, and the blood on the sheet was replaced by a bloodless martyrdom. What does it mean when the state stops asking for proof and starts asking for lifelong sacrifice? By the 4th century CE, Rome had begun to change now with the sudden crash of temples, but with the slow layering of new beliefs over old stones. Christianity, once outlawed and whispered in catacombs, had become the empire's favorite religion. With Constantine's conversion and the Edict of Milan, Christian doctrine moved from the margins to the palace walls. And as the gods of Rome faded into marble dust, a new idea of virginity emerged, one that no longer required linen sheets, but something even harder to offer: lifelong surrender in the pagan world. Virginity was a phase, a temporary condition to be exchanged for marriage, dowry, and reproduction. Its value was in its instinct, eventual yielding. The ideal bride was pure only until the moment of union, when that purity was proven, and then immediately discarded in favor of motherhood. But the Christian ideal turned that expectation on its head. Virginity was no longer a waiting room for marriage. It was a destination, an identity, a kind of bloodless martyrdom offered not to a man, but to God. The early church fathers praised virginity as the highest moral state. In the writings of Ambrose, Jerome, and Augustine, virgins were ranked above widows and wives. They were seen as living sacrifices, spiritual brides of Christ, untouched by sin or flesh. But with that praise came pressure, expectations, surveillance. Virginity was no longer just a fact. It became a vow. With that vow came the burden of visible, continuous proof. Unlike Roman wedding night rituals, Christian virginity could not be proven with a single night's blood. It had to be lived in behavior, in silence, in withdrawal from society. Women who claimed the title of Virgo had to avoid meat. Men, mirrors. They wore rough garments. They wept for Christ. They fasted, and if they faltered, they were accused of having broken their vow. The consequences were not contractual, but eternal. Take the case of Agnes of Rome, one of the earliest and most famous Christian virgin martyrs. A girl of around 13, she was born into a wealthy Roman family and pledged her virginity to Christ. When suitors approached, she refused them all, saying she had already been claimed by a heavenly spouse. The governor's son was among the rejected. Angry, he reported her to the authorities during the Diocletian persecutions. When asked to sacrifice to pagan gods, she refused. Her virginity, she declared, was her shield. She was sentenced to death, but the execution was complicated. First, she was stripped naked and sent to a brothel, her virginity to be shamed before it could be broken. Legend says her hair miraculously grew long enough to cover her body. When no one dared touch her, she was beheaded. Agnes became a saint. But her story illustrates something profound, that virginity had become a battlefield, no longer traded for dowry or sealed in marriage. It was now claimed as ownership, not by fathers or husbands, but by the women themselves. And yet, even that claim was policed. Church authorities began to formalize virginity. The Order of Virgins became a recognized category of the church, particularly after the Council of Trent. Women who took the veil and vowed chastity were often required to undergo examination, not medical, moral. Their speech, habits, and histories were inspected. Some bishops required testimonies from neighbors. Some kept written declarations of lifelong virginity. If a woman faltered, she could be expelled, shamed, or even accused of fraud. The Fraus, Virginitatis of Roman law, had become spiritual. But even within these pressures, some women turned the system into strength. Saints like Cecilia, Euphrosyne, coddled, used their vows as shields against forced marriage. By dedicating their bodies to God, they carved out a kind of autonomy unavailable to wives. They built communities, they preserved property, so even wrote letters and theological works. Virginity, once a transactional state to be lost in one night, became a career, a calling, a quiet resistance. Still, the expectations were relentless. Blood was no longer needed, but blamelessness was. A single rumor could undo years of sacrifice. A late-night visit from a brother, a smile to a messenger, even the softness of one's robe could invite suspicion. And for those who were not saints, not cloistered, not wealthy enough to flee to a convent, what then? They were left suspended, no longer praised for being pure until marriage, no longer able to trade that purity for status, and not quite allowed to keep it without explanation. The Christian redefinition of virginity did not erase the bridal blood. Taxate spiritualized it. Women were no longer expected to prove their worth with the sheet. They were expected to embody it endlessly. The test no longer ended after wedding night, it lasted a lifetime. And so, the obsession endured, transformed, reframed, but still rooted in the same haunting question. Is she untouched? Not because of who she is, but because of who might want to claim her. As we leave the echo of Roman courts and Christian altars behind, we travel now to a different kind of test in medieval France, where a girl's virginity could be challenged, not by gossip or linen, but by a council of experts, midwives, and officials who examined her body in front of witnesses. What did it mean when the state no longer trusted women to tell the truth about their own purity? Hey, and what happens when science is summoned to prove the unprovable? Asterisk, it was not enough for a girl to say she was pure. In medieval France, during the 13th through 16th centuries, virginity was not simply claimed, was inspected, measured, recorded. The courtroom replaced the bedchamber. The midwife replaced the groom, and the bride's word, it meant little. Instead, her body became a site of official inquiry, not because she had committed a crime, but because she had dared to marry with the assumption of virtue. Asterisk. You are standing inside a stone chamber in a provincial town, perhaps Rouen or Dijon. The air is cold and slightly damp. A wooden chair rests in the center of the room, and beside it, a low table with a bowl of vinegar, a roll of cloth, and a pair of linen cords. 3 women wait in silence: a midwife, an older matron from the bride's village, and a notary. They are not here for healing. They are here to test. Outside the door, the families argue. The case is familiar. Nobleman young, anxious, eager to prove his masculine authority, has returned to the town magistrate. One day, after his wedding night, to report a scandal, his bride did not bleed. He says she showed no signs of resistance, that the bed was clean, that she must have been defiled before marriage. His family supports him. They demand the return of the dowry. They accuse the bride's father of deception. The bride's mother weeps. The girl says nothing, because it is no longer in her hands. These were not uncommon events in the legal and cultural frameworks of medieval France, particularly among the landed. The class's virginity was not merely symbolic. It was legal evidence capable of being brought forward, disputed, or discredited in court. And when that evidence was in doubt, the town authorities summoned midwives, not doctors, not clerics, midwives, because they were women, because they had seen birth and injury and innocence, because they were believed, often falsely too, be able to determine the truth of a girl's past from her body. The tests were crude. One method involved inserting a thin linen cord or thread into the bride's vagina. If the thread met resistance, if the midwife reported a membrane, the girl was declared intact. Another method involved vinegar or cold water meant to provoke a reaction, tension, or a flinch that could be interpreted as proof. More commonly, the bride was made to walk or hop, and her physical response, pain, hesitation, bleeding was observed and judged, and in some cases, midwives looked for signs of use, discoloration, looseness, or small scars. These were subjective, unscientific, often humiliating practices, but they were treated as evidence. In one case, from 1495, a girl named Jeanette of Tours was inspected by 4 women appointed by the court. Their report survives in a local archive. They declared that the maiden's body bore signs of having been known carnally, though no further detail is given. Jeanette protested. She claimed to have been injured in childhood. Her husband refused to believe her. The court ordered the return of half her dowry. This was the virginity. Test, a ritual of shame disguised as science. It was often demanded not at the moment of marriage, but after, when a husband saw divorce, or when inheritance was at stake, or when an alliance began to sour. It gave men a legal pathway to invalidate a marriage without blame, return their financial investment. In many cases, test was less about truth and more about control, a means of ensuring that women remained vulnerable, that their worth could be contested at any time. Their bodies, even after marriage, remained subject to review. Not all cases ended in punishment. Some midwives defended the girls. Some judges refused to act. In a few communities, the tests were mocked, especially when they involved women of status. But the practice endured, sometimes as law, sometimes as tradition, and it wasn't always initiated by men. In one rare instance, a mother-in-law accused a new bride of impurity and demanded a test. The bride's own father agreed, hoping to avoid a larger scandal. The test was inconclusive. The marriage ended anyway, and for the girls, they were often left in limbo. A failed virginity test did not mean criminal conviction. It meant social death. They could be cast out, sent back to their family homes, labeled as ruined even if they had never lain with a man. They were no longer desirable. Their chances at a second marriage dropped. Their lives narrowed to service, silence, and survival, because in this world, single absence of blood, of resistance, of some imagined sign was treated as a betrayal, and betrayals required restitution. But what about those who refused? What of the rare girls who declined to be examined, who challenged the very premise that their bodies needed proof? In the next section, we followed the story of Marguerite de Saint-Lay, a merchant's daughter who stood before a bishop and refused to be tested, and whose case would be whispered about in courtrooms for decades. What gave her the courage? What did she lose for it? Staris, the court expected her to tremble. Instead, she stood with her hands folded neatly, eyes steady, lips sealed, except when asked to speak. Marguerite de Saint-Lay was 19, the daughter of a well-known wool merchant in Normandy. Her marriage had been celebrated with all proper forms: a contract, a dowry, a feast attended by half the town. Her groom was Guillaume de Launay, the son of a lower nobleman, Tay. The match elevated her family's status. It was meant to smooth the line between money and blood. The morning after the wedding, Guillaume filed a complaint. He claimed Marguerite had deceived him, that there had been no blood, that her body gave no resistance, that she must have lost her virginity before marriage. An act he called insidious fraud. The court summoned her, and she refused the test. This, in itself, was extraordinary. The usual response from accused brides was weeping, pleading, or, in some cases, reluctant submission to the humiliating procedure. A group of matronly examiners, midwives, or older women from the parish would be assembled. Tests would be conducted behind closed doors, or recorded in writing. No judgment was passed without the results, but Marguerite declined, not in panic, but in principle. Her refusal is recorded in a small, brittle document, housed today in the Archives Nationales in Paris. Written in faded Latin, it notes simply, she declined the examination, citing indignity and injury to her person. She claimed the accusation was false. She claimed Guillaume was seeking a way out of the marriage for reasons unrelated to purity. And then she said something no one expected. She accused him. Marguerite claimed her husband had been unable to consummate the marriage and, in his shame, had turned the blame toward her. She stated that she had no previous relations, no secrets, no dishonor. She said her conscience was clean and that she would not be touched or examined like livestock. The room fell silent. Her words challenged every assumption the court held about marriage, sex, and credibility. In medieval French society, a woman's purity was presumed only until questioned. Once challenged, the burden of proof fell on her. Silence was not her ally. Obedience was expected. Her refusal was seen not just as defiance, but as guilt. But Marguerite did not falter. Her father supported her. He brought forth 2 character witnesses, women from the town who testified to her modesty, her routine, her avoidance of male company. A midwife who had cared for Marguerite during an illness 2 years earlier stated under oath that the girl had never shown signs of prior intercourse. Still, the judge wavered in a closed deliberation. The court considered its options. They could force the examination, though doing so would have required the consent of the bishop, and risked public backlash. They could declare the marriage null, which would damage both families, or they could encourage reconciliation. The records show a compromise. Marguerite and Guillaume were ordered to remain married. They were instructed to live separately for a period of reflection. And Guillaume was granted no financial claim against the dowry. In short, the court did nothing. But outside the courtroom, the damage had been done. Whispers followed Marguerite. Wherever she walked, some believed her, others did not. Her mother stopped attending church for several months. Guillaume left town under unclear circumstances and did not return. Marguerite lived with her parents for 3 more years. Then, quietly, she entered a biganage, a lay religious community of women not bound by formal vows. There, she managed to count, taught younger girls to write. Kink became known for her careful speech and unshakable calm. She never remarried. She never retracted her refusal. Her name surfaces again years later in a letter from a local abbot. Refers to her as that upright woman who would not submit to the thread. And thus, Marguerite became a symbol, not of rebellion, but of restraint, a woman who did not fight the law. Pete simply declined to entertain its assumptions. Her case was discussed in other courtrooms. Some judges cited it as precedent to question the reliability of virginity tests. Others dismissed it as a fluke. A few preachers used her story in sermons, warning against women too proud to be corrected. But the idea that a woman could say no to inspection, even under accusation, did not disappear. Marguerite had created a crack, a small one, but enough, and yet the tests continued in towns and villages. For decades more, girls were still examined, still measured, still subjected to the contradiction of being asked to prove something cueable. The thread remained knotted, the linen still scrutinized, the truth still disregarded. In our final section, we turn to the slow unraveling of the virginity test across Europe. What role did emerging science, skeptical priests, and shifting legal standards play in ending these practices? And why, even after the tests were abandoned, did the doubt remain? It did not end with a law. No royal decree swept down from Paris to outlaw the virginity tests. No bishop rose in the pulpit to condemn the practice outright. The unraveling came slowly, one frayed thread at a time. By the early 17th century, in the cobbled towns and fading feudal courts of France, the testing of brides was no longer routine. Midwives were still summoned occasionally. Whispered accusations still surfaced, but the age of linen courts and vinegar basins was quietly passing. What replaced it was not trust. It was doubt, more silent, less theatrical, but just as heavy. Historians mark this transition not by a moment, but by the shrinking presence of evidence. Court records that once detailed physical examinations now simply note character testimony. Medical texts begin to cast suspicion on the validity of virginity tests, and some town officials, weary of scandals and shame, began to dismiss cases before they reached the courtroom. The new skepticism did not arise from kindness. It came from science. Physicians and natural philosophers of the late Renaissance men, trained in anatomy, often through dissection and experiment, began to question the logic behind traditional virginity tests. Andreas Vesalius, writing in the 16th century, warned that the hymen was not a reliable indicator of chastity. Some women, he observed, had no visible membrane at all. Others retained it after intercourse. More significantly, midwives themselves began to push back. In one 1622 dispute from Lyon, a midwife named Elizabeth de Clare refused to examine a young bride, arguing that no instrument nor eye may know what God alone has seen. Her refusal made headlines in the ecclesiastical court, but she was not punished. In fact, she was called upon again the next year, and again she refused. The church, too, shifted uneasily. Confessors in the 17th and 18th centuries were increasingly taught not to probe too deeply into questions of premarital sex unless the penitent raised the topic herself. The Virgin Mary remained the ultimate ideal, but church leaders also recognized that spiritual purity might not always match physical assumptions. Still, the marriage market had not changed. Fathers still demanded dowries, families still needed proof, and women still lived under the weight of suspicion. Some found ways to adapt. In Bordeaux, a woman accused of impurity after marriage presented a notarized statement from her childhood nurse, detailing an accident that might have altered her anatomy. The court dismissed the case. In Reims, a girl whose sheets bore no blood on her wedding night quietly pricked her finger and stained the cloth herself. Her husband never questioned her again. And in Montpellier, merchant's daughter preemptively announced her non-virginity in front of witnesses before her wedding, declaring that her worth did not lie in a membrane, but in her loyalty. Marriage was canceled, but the story spread. By the 18th century, the tests had become embarrassing relics of superstition, useful only in remote villages or petty disputes. Lawyers no longer cited them. Doctors discouraged them. Even literature began to mock them. Key Kobe in satirical pamphlets. Old women squinted at bed sheets and were ridiculed. The virginity test became a joke, but the fear behind it never quite faded. And that is where the thread lingers. For centuries, virginity had been something external, something to be proven, displayed, defended. The tests may have vanished, but the logic remained. Women were still judged for past lovers, still categorized by modesty, still told that their value rested in restraint, not in reason. Even today, echoes remain in questions asked during wedding nights, in whispered doubts, in cultures where sheets are still checked, or rumors still spread. The test continues, not in thread or vinegar, but in silence. So what did we learn from the long, strange history of virginity testing in medieval France? That the desire to measure the unmeasurable often says more about power than truth. That science may change the tools, but not always the thinking. And that the burden of proof has always fallen hardest on those without a voice. Next, we move to Mesopotamia, where the idea of a bride's worth was recorded in contracts, not cloth. There, in the land of ancient scribes and clay tablets, virginity was not just expectation, it was a clause, a condition of the dowry, and sometimes was a death sentence. What happened when a bride failed to meet those written expectations? A date. How did the world's first laws turn purity into policy? Asterisk. It begins not with love, but with clay in ancient Mesopotamia. Before paper, before parchment, before inked contracts on goatskin, there were tablets, rectangular slabs of sun-baked earth, etched with a stylus and sealed with the names of men. These were not poetic documents. They were not declarations of passion or joy. They were contracts meticulously recorded in cuneiform, wrapped in layers of ritual and law. And among them, there is a phrase that repeats again and again, across centuries, across cities, across dynasties. The bride is a virgin. You are standing in the bustling heart of Ur, sometime around 1800 BCE. Under the reign of Hammurabi's predecessors, the air is dry and fragrant with burning reeds and cooking onions. Merchants shout prices, donkeys bray, and scribes sit cross-legged under awnings, preparing contracts. One of these scribes is writing on behalf of a man named Nadintua, modest grain merchant, preparing to marry off his daughter. Her name is not recorded, but her virginity is. The contract outlines the arrangement. The groom, a brewer's son, agrees to pay a specified bride price, a kind of early dowry paid to the bride's father. The father, in return, guarantees that his daughter is pure. If this claim is found to be false, the groom may return the bride. In some cases, the father must refund the bride price. In more serious cases, especially if deception is proven, the daughter may be punished. The contract does not say if she is not loved. It does not say if she is unhappy. It says, if she is not a virgin. This was not a suspicion. It was a clause as central as the amount of silver exchanged or the delivery of livestock, and it revealed something quietly brutal about the Mesopotamian marriage market. Virginity was currency, and that currency was guaranteed by men who neither owned it nor suffered for its loss. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest surviving legal codes in the world, codifies this system. Written around 1754 BCE, it contains hundreds of laws, from irrigation fines to surgical penalties, but among them are laws 128 to 138, focused on marriage. Law 130, in particular, is harsh if a man violates the virginity of another man's daughter before she is betrothed. He shall pay silver, and the girl shall be returned to her father's house. Law 131 adds, if a man accuses his wife of not being a virgin, and the accusation is false, he shall be fined. But if the accusation is true, the wife may be cast out. There is a dark symmetry here. The man may suffer financially if he lies, but the woman may lose everything: status, safety, even life. And so, The fear took root early in villages and cities. Fathers kept daughters close. Their movements were watched. Servants were assigned to escort them. Ritual baths were prescribed. In some wealthier households, chastity amulets, small clay tokens, were placed in the girl's room to invoke divine protection over her purity. But divine protection was unreliable, and contracts could not be undone. 1. Fragment from Nipper. Now in a museum in Istanbul, records a particularly tragic case. The woman, Leela II, was married to Enlil Mansum. After 3 nights, he brought her back, saying she was not a virgin. The contract was examined. The price was returned. Litu was taken to the river and bathed in silence. Taged. The record ends there, but the silence is louder than any punishment. It is the silence of erasure. Once rejected, a woman like Lilitu would struggle to marry again. She might be given to a temple as a servant. She might live with relatives unseen. Her name might vanish from ledgers entirely. She was not punished by law. She was punished by custom. And yet, some families took precautions. We find contracts where fathers write additional clauses. Should the bride be found to have been harmed or dishonored by another man, through no fault of her own, the agreement shall stand. This suggests an awareness of risk, a hint that not all lost virginities were consensual, that in some cases, rape or abuse threatened the dowry just as much as a daughter's rebellion. But the law was blunt. It could not distinguish, well, between trauma and choice. It only saw value in whether it had been spent. So what does this reveal? That in ancient Mesopotamia, marriage was less about people than about property. The bride was not quite a product, but her virginity was. And that value was written into the first legal codes in history. Before kings wore crowns, before scribes wrote poetry, before temples crumbled and gods changed names, there were already contracts, and inside those contracts, already, women were bargaining chips. But what happens when the bride refuses the terms? What if she is accused unfairly? What if she dares to challenge the contract that binds her? In the next section, we examine the story of Ninsan of Sipra, a young woman whose case made it into court, and whose testimony survives as one of the oldest recorded defenses of female honor. What did she say? And did anyone believe her? The record is incomplete. A fragment of a clay tablet, cracked at the edges, housed now in a drawer at the British Museum. But even in fragments, history speaks. It tells the story of a girl named Ninsin, daughter of Bazi, a coppersmith in the temple town of Sipar on the Euphrates eastern bank. The tablet is dated to around 1720 BCE, and the writing is urgent typescript, dense with abbreviations. It is not a poem. It is not a prayer. It is a legal declaration, a courtroom speech, likely written by a scribe for the defense, and it begins with words that have echoed across civilizations. She says she is innocent. Ninsin was 15. She had been married 2 weeks prior to a man named Idrimi, a livestock broker from further south. The wedding was modest gifts exchanged, hands joined before family and gods, the customary meal of lentils and date beer served. There had been no complaints until the 3rd day. Then Idrimi returned to the temple scribes, claiming that Ninsan was not a virgin. He offered no evidence, only assertion. He demanded that her father return the bride price 12 shekels of silver, along with a small herd of goats and 2 jars of oil. Normally, this would have been enough. The scribe would record the return. Ninsin would be sent home. Out. The marriage dissolved. No further questions asked. But Bazi did something unusual. He refused. He insisted his daughter was innocent, that she had been protected, chaperoned, and chaste. And then, more remarkably, he requested a formal hearing before the city court, and Ninsin was brought to testify. Her words, though filtered through the stylus of a male scribe, retained something raw. The tablet is damaged, but this much remains. I was given. I did not resist. There was pain, and then silence. He lay with me only once. I bled. He saw it. Then he turned away. On the second night, he drank. On the third, he said I was unworthy. It is a rare voice, not because it is dramatic Mesopotamian law favored the functional, but because a woman was speaking. It's not about her feelings. It's not about her love, but about her body in public. In defense of her honor, the court responded by convening a group of witnesses, not from the marriage night, but from the days prior. Servants, neighbors, the midwife who helped prepare Ninson's bridal oil, each gave statements. One line stands out. Her garments were sealed. Her face was veiled. She was watched. None saw her stray. In ancient Sippar, this was as close to an affidavit of purity as one could get. The court hesitated, but still dreamy, pressed. Te claimed Nensan had been seen near the market alone weeks before, that she had lingered too long at the well, that she had smiled at a younger man and named, unproven. He could produce no witness to the act, only innuendo, and so the court made its ruling. It refused to return the bride price. It declared the marriage valid, but it also did something quietly cruel. It gave Igdrimi the right to take a second wife, without dissolving the first. Ninsen was to remain married, but relegated, her status lowered, her voice dismissed. Her family appealed to the temple. The temple refused. Her father offered to return the silver just to free her. The court denied him. The marriage would remain for appearance, for politics, for precedent. And so Ninsen remained in Idrimi's household for 2 more years, then disappears from the records. There are no receipts in her name, no children listed, no funerary rites recorded. She may have been divorced quietly, she may have died, but her declaration survives. A small thing, 1 tablet, but in it we find something profound. A girl who dared to say, I was honest, I did bleed. He saw it, and lied, in a world that measured worth in contracts, goats, and linen. Ninsen's defense is revolutionary. She did not appeal to romance. She did not cry for pity. She stood in the logic of the law and asked for consistency, and the law flinched. But her case raises deeper questions. If truth could be spoken and still be dismissed, if contracts could be honored while women were erased, then was virginity ever about honor? Or was it always just a negotiation, dressed up as morality? In the final section of this story, we will examine how the bride price itself became a tool of power wand that shifted as empires rose and fell, and how fathers learned to manipulate the system to maximize their daughter's value, even at her expense. Who really profited from purity? What happened when the value of virginity became too high? Asterisk. The story of Ninsan of Sippar is just one among thousands, but it opens a crack through which we glimpse something more systemic, something quieter, more bureaucratic, and far more enduring than personal injustice. What happened to her wasn't a fluke. It was part of a larger economy, an economy in which virginity wasn't just a moral status. It was a form of currency, and like any currency, it could inflate. Let us shift the focus from Sippar to Ishnana, a wealthy city-state along the Tigris River. Sometime around 1800 BCE, it was a city famed for its irrigation canals, its grain exports, and its clay archives. It was also a city where the bride price had begun to rise. Inflation of the intangible, the bride price of payment from groom's family to bride's father, was originally modest. In early Sumerian society, it might consist of a few shekels of silver, some grain, or perhaps a bolt of fine wool. It was a symbolic gesture, a recognition of lost labor, perhaps compensation for transferring guardianship. But by the 2nd millennium BCE, in regions like Ishnana and Mari, the price had skyrocketed. Fathers began demanding more silver, more livestock, more textiles. Some included clauses in the marriage contract demanding future payments if the wife gave birth to sons. Others required retainers or security deposits in case the groom tried to divorce her. The reason for this inflation: one word: purity. Virginity was now more than expected. It was marketed. Fathers would bring temple scribes to draft formal contracts certifying their daughters. Modesty. Girls were trained to walk and speak in ways that projected innocence. Families built reputations over generations to ensure their daughters would command higher prices. In one archive from Mari, a nobleman named Ashkarad wrote to his brother in another city, "Do not send the girl unless her veils are still intact. Well, not pay 15 shekels if there are rumors about her." The veil here is likely symbolic. It referred not to literal fabric, but to social reputation. A girl's veil had to be unbroken by suspicion, gossip, or even excessive friendliness. And so, families became investors in their daughters' reputations. Their purity became a kind of social capital, accumulated and spent carefully. But this came with consequences. The rise of fictive daughters. In some cases, families began adopting young girls not for charity, but for profit. Wealthy couples without children would take in orphaned girls, raise them under strict supervision, and later sell them into marriage for high prices. They were referred to in contracts as daughters by the gods. On paper, these adoptions looked like acts of piety. In reality, they were often business transactions. The adoptive parents invested in feeding, sheltering, and guarding the girl. In return, they expected a return: silver, land, and prestige. When she married, in one preserved tablet from the city of Nuzi, a man named Ilkaya sued his adopted daughter for breaking a marriage contract. She had eloped with a man of lower status. Ilkaya argued, not as a father, but as a creditor. "I gave her oil, cloth, protection. She was to bring me 22 shekels in marriage. She betrayed her oath. She was not a daughter. She was a portfolio virginity. Becomes a liability. Eventually, the system began to strain. As bride prices climbed, poorer families could no longer compete. Their daughters became increasingly unmarriageable. And so, some fathers began to fabricate evidence of purity. Midwives were bribed to prepare sheets soaked in lamb's blood. Young girls were taught to feign discomfort and shyness. Some ancient medical texts even suggest the use of tightening herbal compresses inserted vaginally before the wedding night to simulate virginity in a society where actual physical proof was elusive. Performance became everything, but even performance couldn't save everyone. The devaluation begins by 1600 BCE. A shift can be seen. Tablets from smaller cities begin recording lower bride prices again. Contracts include more loopholes. Some fathers explicitly waive the right to return the price if the marriage fails. In other cases, the bride is described not as pure, but as of strong character. This suggests a recalibration. When purity became too costly to guarantee, society redefined value. Instead of virginity, some grooms began looking for wives who could manage estates, raise sons, or oversee servants. Marriage, slowly and unevenly, began to return to its more practical foundations. Not entirely, not quickly, but the trend is visible. In one telling record from the city of Uruk, a man agrees to marry a widow unheard of a generation prior. His only condition: she shall bring no quarrel into the household, no mention of purity, no return clauses, peace. Lessons from Clay. The tablets don't moralize. They don't celebrate romance. They don't mourn the girls whose names were scratched out after scandal. They simply record what happened. And from these records, we begin to see the outlines of a truth that rarely makes it into grand historical epics. Virginity was never just a state. It was an investment, sometimes treasured, sometimes exploited. And like all investments, it was shaped by fear, greed, Rumor ran, occasionally, by courage. What became of the girls whose fathers could not afford to prove their purity? What happened to the daughters who were used as collateral, then forgotten? And when virginity lost its market value, what replaced it in the ancient marriage economy? These are the quiet questions left behind in clay, ink, and ash, not shouted through time, but whispered, waiting, just like Ninsen. Asterisk, imagine it's a spring morning in classical Athens. The air is soft with dust, stirred from the streets below. Merchants shout half-heartedly about olives and salted fish. But up on the second floor of the household, different sound reigns. The dull clack of the loom, not the grand mechanical contraptions of later centuries, but simple, upright frames, strung tightly with vertical threads. The weft is beaten in place by slender fingers. Always slender, always silent. This is the Virginity women's quarters. And here, behind thick stone walls and lattice screens, the most honorable women of the household are hard at work. Producing more than cloth, they are manufacturing virtue, the fabric of reputation in ancient Greece, especially Athens, during the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. A woman's place was not only separate, it was symbolic. To be secluded was not simply a matter of logistics. It was a sign of respectability, restraint, and most of all, purity. This concept extended deeply into textile work. Weaving for the Athenian woman was not just a duty, it was a declaration. A declaration of her domesticity. K, of her disinterest in public affairs. K, of her untouched nature. To weave was to be marriageable. The act of sitting beside the loom, day after day, was both a productive activity and a performative ritual. It showed that a girl was not out in the marketplace, not participating in festivals without a chaperone, certainly not speaking with men outside her family. The loom was a certification device, its warped threads, a contract, Penelope, a model, or a myth. You might recall the story of Penelope, the wife of Odysseus. In Homer's epic, she delays choosing a new husband by weaving a shroud during the day and secretly unpicking it at night. Her weaving becomes both shield and sword, a defense of her chastity and a clever political maneuver. In later Athenian society, Penelope becomes the archetype. Plato praises her. So does Aristotle. Even Xenophon refers to women's weaving as the central axis of household virtue. But here's what's quietly strange. The ideal Athenian wife is praised not for being visible, vocal, or even biologically fertile, but for being invisible, silent, and busy at the loom. Marriage contracts. Yes, actual written agreements often mentioned whether a bride had been properly trained in domestic arts. And among the top virtues listed, weaving. More important than music, more important than education. Sometimes even listed above beauty. To understand why, you have to examine the loom itself, not just as a tool, but as a symbolic enclosure. Behind, the lattice to gymnasium was almost always upstairs or in the back of the house. The architecture was deliberate. Women's quarters were located away from courtyards and away from guests. Latticed windows provided light, but not visibility. The sounds of the loom could float through the house, reminding everyone that a woman was present and proper, but she herself was unseen. This is the architecture of virtue. A man's honor depended on how well he kept his women hidden. His daughters, sisters, and wives were assets protected behind doors and dowries, even in classical drama. When a woman appears on stage, she is often spoken for or hidden behind metaphorical walls. If she breaks free, tragedy is near. And so, for real women living in Athens or Sparta or Corinth, the loom was more than an instrument of labor. It was a barrier. It was a reputation machine, and it produced not just textiles, but a kind of sexual silence, a currency in threads. Dowries in ancient Greece included more than money and land. They also included cloth, tie, tunics, blankets, Ceremonial robes, all woven by the bride herself or her female kin, became part of her value. Weaving was team-intensive. It was precise. It was proof of patience. And in a society where virginity was invisible and accusations could destroy a family's name, the cloth was physical evidence of good behavior. I kept her indoors, a father could say. She spun, she wove, she was busy. To be idle, to avoid the loom, was a red flag. Gossip might begin. Why was she walking in the garden? Kara, why was she speaking with the nurse in hushed tones? Why was she looking out the window? Idle hands raised suspicion, and suspicion degraded value. Not all could hide, of course. Not every woman had the luxury of silence and thread. Slave women wove too, but their labor did not certify virtue. Their work produced cloth, but not reputation. In fact, the same skill that made a free woman virtuous made a slave woman profitable. This contrast was visible everywhere. Wealthy households might own 5, 10, or even 20 female slaves, many dedicated entirely to weaving. These enslaved women often worked in shifts, sometimes around the clock. Their cloth was sold in markets, traded, or added to dowries, but their virtue, it was never counted. The value of their work lay in production, not in implication, and this leads to a cruel, current paradox. In ancient Greece, the more valuable a woman's reputation, the less visible she became. Her voice, her thoughts, her body, folded away behind wool and walls. So what happened when the loom was abandoned? What of the women who refused to weave, the ones who were never taught? Did they lose their value or forge another kind? And how did the silent rhythm of the loom shape not only women's lives, but the marriage market itself? Asterisk in the still, fabric-scented shadows of the Geneseum. Most women complied, but not all. History has a way of hiding those who disobeyed quietly. In the silence of archives, names are missing, deeds go unrecorded, and so many gestures of dissent vanish without consequence or recognition, and yet, some of them ripple through time. This section explores the lives and consequences of women who stepped away from the loom, either by choice or circumstance, what it meant for their value in the ancient marriage market, where virginity and visibility were inseparably linked. Aspasia, the woman with no threats. Let us begin with Aspasia of Miletus. She is often remembered as the consort of Pericles, one of Athens' most prominent leaders during its golden age. But before we assign her to the realm of romance or scandal, pause for a moment. Aspasia was not Athenian by birth. She was an immigrant, a foreigner, and therefore she could never marry into respectable Athenian society. But she lived with Pericles, entertained philosophers, spoke in public, hosted salons where politics, poetry, and metaphysics were discussed, and nowhere in the scattered references to her do we find mention of weaving. She lived beyond the loom, to some. This made her dangerously seductive. To others, dangerously intelligent. Plutarch, in his biographical sketches, could not decide whether to label her a courtesan or a teacher. Socrates, we are to trust the records, visited her for conversations, not entertainment. She was articulate, persuasive, and politically savvy, and yet she was un-marriageable. No dowry, no threads, no cloistered chastity. Her intellect became her currency, not her domestic silence, but this came at a cost, the cost of public femininity, to be a woman outside. The Geneseum was to be viewed with suspicion. In Athenian law courts, it was not uncommon for women who testified or were seen in public to have their sexual honor questioned, regardless of their innocence. A woman walking without a veil or entering the agora without a male relative could be assumed to be promiscuous, a hetera, or worse. Even respected religious roles, like priestesses, carried a paradox. Women in service to goddesses like Athena or Demeter were revered, but they were also seen as exceptions, not models. They were virgins consecrated to the divine, and therefore allowed limited forms of public presence. Even then, their behavior was closely scripted. Any deviation from ritual norms could result in accusations of sacrilege and in some cases, execution. The girls who did not weave for the lower classes. Weaving was not a performance, it was survival. A poor girl without a dowry might spin wool for sale, hoping to earn enough to avoid prostitution or slavery. In rural areas, the line between respectable labor and suspect exposure was thinner. Shepherd girls, field workers, and domestic servants were often young and female and visible. In a cruel twist, their labor made them more likely to be exploited. Visibility, once again, became vulnerability. Some ancient sources suggest that girls who did not weave were labeled pares si extraneous. It meant they were not part of the productive, hidden domestic economy. They were a burden to the household. If unmarried, such girls could be apprenticed out as wet nurses, market vendors, or grape pickers. Each of these roles required exposure of the body, of the face, of the voice. Their chances of making a respectable marriage dwindled with each passing season. Virginity, for them, was not a currency. It was a gamble, and the stakes were highest when the loom sat empty. The shift toward manufactured chastity by the 4th century BCE, the value of virginity had become so institutionalized that entire ritual systems were built to protect it. The Arctea, for example, was a festival where young girls played the bear in honor of Artemis. It was meant to mark a transition from wild childhood to disciplined domestic womanhood. Girls ran races, danced in groups, and participated in purification. Rites not, but central to the celebration. A return to domestic order. The rituals ended not with marriage, but with readiness for seclusion. A girl who completed such rites and then learned to weave was seen as prepared. Her body and labor both untouched. Her value doubled in this environment. To not participate was to suggest one's body had strayed. In fact, legal records from Athens show that when a woman's virginity was questioned before marriage, her family could be fined or forced to return the dowry. Her husband could divorce her without penalty, and her social position would collapse. No weaving, no cloistered years, no symbolic signs of restraint, and so the social system learned to enforce weaving as moral currency. But what if she couldn't weave? There is also the matter of disability, though ancient records rarely address it openly. What happened when a girl injured her hands, or her sight failed? Was she considered defective? A few medical texts by Hippocrates mention conditions that might affect female usefulness, but they frame them in biological terms: excessive blood, uterine displacement, or hysteria. None mention impaired dexterity, the variability that would prevent a woman from weaving. In most cases, such women would be hidden or relegated to the care of temple charities. Some may have joined religious orders. Others may have been quietly excluded from marriage altogether. Their inability to weave transformed into moral doubt. Her hands didn't move, so perhaps her legs did. Even now, the shadow of such logic feels disturbing. The loom as witness sand, so we return to the central paradox. The loom, though silent, spoke volumes. It told suitors that a girl was obedient, that her body was as ordered as her threads, that she did not speak out, move freely, or desire beyond the patterns set for her. The cloth she produced became evidence, not just of productivity, but of stillness. A girl might never need to say a word. The quality of her cloth would speak for her. But if the loom sat idle, the room grew dangerous. Whispers formed, reputations frayed, and the threads of virtue began to unravel. What then happens when the loom becomes a burden instead of a badge? When the pressure to produce silence outweighs the fabric itself. And how did the act of weaving, so central to this economy of virginity, become a tool of control, not expression? A loom is not a prison in the way walls and locks are. It is quiet, repetitive, respectable, and yet, for many women in ancient Greece, the loom was a sentence served in plain sight, not because of what it was, but because of what it represented. By the time a girl reached marriageable age, often as young as 12 or 13, she had already spent countless hours bent over wool, spindle, and thread. Her body trained to stay still, her voice trained not to speak unless asked, her mind occupied by patterns passed down from generations of compliant women. The loom wasn't just a tool of labor. It was a symbol of submission, and submission was, quite literally, worth something. Dowries, woven in silence dowries, in ancient Athens and other city-states, were rarely about gold. They were land, livestock, and, above all, fabric. Tunic sets, chitons, wraps for ceremonies, linen for the household. A dowry's value was often inflated by the quantity of woven goods the bride brought with her. These were not decorative gifts. They were proof that she could labor quietly, proof that she had been kept hidden and busy, proof that she had value beyond her body and, yet, always tethered to it. In this way, weaving became a contract of trust, especially among families of modest means. An elite man might marry for alliance, but a craftsman, a merchant, or a hoplite might marry for fabric for a wife who brought literal value to his domestic economy. And so, for the average girl, the pressure to spin her worth into thread was immense. If she failed, she was less likely to be married. If she excelled, she was more likely to be controlled. It was a loop with no exit. Penelope's endless weaving nowhere is this dynamic clearer than in the myth of Penelope, wife of Odysseus. For 20 years, she waits for her husband's return from the Trojan War and his long wanderings. In that time, dozens of suitors attempt to court her. She resists. How? By weaving a burial shroud. She promises to suitors she will choose a new husband once the shroud is completed. But each night, she unravels the day's work, undoing her own progress. It's a clever act of resistance, often praised in literature. It's a testament to her loyalty. But consider the layers. She uses the loom, the very symbol of domestic virtue, as a shield. She uses its assumed invisibility to hide rebellion. In Penelope's case, weaving was a form of agency. And yet, it is also clear that she had no other socially acceptable tools of delay. But she could not leave. She could not speak her mind. She could only continue to be seen as chaste, loyal, and silent. Her resistance had to look like obedience to be tolerated. It's a contradiction that echoes through history. When women wove messages, there were other moments rare but remarkable. Women used thread for something more explicit. Ancient graffiti in parts of Greece references coded stitching in ritual garments, patterns sewn into sacred cloth that may have carried double meanings. Some textiles uncovered from burial sites carry motifs that don't appear in domestic weavings, suggesting they were meant to be seen, not worn. Historians remain divided on whether these were acts of artistic expression or messages buried within a socially acceptable framework. In either case, it was a risk. A woman who embroidered the wrong symbol or refused to finish a pattern assigned by her husband or mistress could be beaten or banished. Yet still, the occasional act of rebellion threads its way through the record. In one curious 4th century vase painting, a woman is shown standing before a loom but instead of wool. Her loom holds no threads at all. Instead, a scroll rests at her feet. Her face is turned toward the viewer, unmasked. Some scholars believe this was a symbolic representation of a woman who chose writing over weaving, a woman who opted for ideas instead of cloth. And, like all anomalies in ancient Greek art, her presence is ambiguous. Is she punished, honored, forgotten? We do not know, okay? But we remember her still. The unspoken sorrow of seamstressizing among those who complied with the expectations of domestic weaving. There are signs of exhaustion. Archaeological digs of small homes in Attica revealed tiny stone stools, worn smooth on the edges, placed beside upright looms. Some had faint carvings, perhaps idle etchings from long hours of repetition. Small prayers, marks of days gone. A kind of domestic diary with no words. In one home, an oil lamp was found inside the loom's frame, a sign that the weaver worked into the night, long after the rest of the home had quieted. These were not women of power. They were daughters, wives, sisters, and the lamp's soft flame would have cast long shadows over the threads, revealing how thin the line was between obedience and despair. Unweaving the myth of virginity, weaving, virginity, and value were tangled. Concepts in ancient Greece: to be virgin was to be intact, just as fabric could be unworn. To be productive at the loom was to be useful, just as cloth had utility. And so the metaphors multiplied. A girl was a bolt of cloth cut only by her husband. His wife was a woven tapestry useful until threadbare. A widow was a garment undone, patched, or discarded. These metaphors were so embedded that they bled into language. Even today, the word spinster reflects a woman whose life is defined by spinning because she never married. But what happens when we stop seeing these acts as metaphors and start seeing them as tools? The loom controlled more than wool. It shaped behavior, taught stillness, trained hands and minds toward compliance. It was the mechanism by which virginity became measurable, and that is perhaps the most chilling part. Some women, like Penelope, managed to manipulate the threads. Others, like Aspasia, escaped the loom entirely but paid for their freedom. Most, however, simply wove in silence, their lives bundled and bartered in cloth. What does it mean that the most praised virtue of a woman was something that could be produced, stored, displayed, and exchanged? And when weaving stopped being about fabric and started being about proof, had the very concept of womanhood already been reduced to a pattern?